My name is Brandon White. I am the Education Program Manager here at NICE, and I'm going to be leading tonight's training. This is basically going to be a session of all the really important information we like our volunteers to know before they engage our clients. So part of this is cultural sensitivity tips. It's also a profile of our clients, a description of the journey that refugees go through as they come into the country for the first time, some of the challenges they still face once they're here, and then also how our wraparound services are designed to meet those challenges at every step of that journey. I'm also joined tonight by fellow staff member Becca Hoopy, who I'll let, did I say your last name right?
Close, so close.
Close.
It's Becca Huppy.
Huppy.
Puppy like puppy. So if I'm ever working with children, I always tell them to call me Miss Puppy. So I guess you all can call me that too. But hi, everyone. I am the brand new volunteer coordinator. And so I've communicated with most of you as far as sending you invites to this. But I'm really excited to have you all join us and to hear what Brandon has to tell us as well.
Yeah, and you know, you guys are in a really unique position. We have not really had a general volunteer orientation since the pandemic really hit Nashville and schools closed in March. So we've done a few one-off trainings for people that were kind of shifting roles in the agency as volunteers, but nothing brand new. So this is a really unique experience, and some of the things that you'll see tonight, we're going to have to consider how to augment or modify now that we're in this virtual service delivery model, which we'll talk a little bit about here really shortly. I guess the other unique thing about this particular training is I almost always do these in a tie. So I decided to be a little tongue-in-cheek and dress festively and not too dressed down. But it's very out of element for all of us, I think. So I'm really glad that you all were able to join us. I know this is not the easiest time of day to hold attention. A lot of you are probably tired from working all day long or have been trapped inside the house for months on end and really ready to get out and get active again. So hopefully we can make this really thorough, but also to the point. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and just go over some of the norms we have for this meeting. I actually borrowed this from our counterparts at Nashville Public Library. We use this with some of our working groups. So if you do have the ability to be on video, we would love to see your face. I do understand, we understand that not everyone can do that, and that there may be a reason why you have to turn your video off at some point. No problem. If you are able, we'd love to see you. If not, it's not a requirement. I do ask that you silence all notifications both on your desktop and your phone. Most applications like GChat will have a suspend feature where your notifications can be turned off temporarily. If you are not speaking, please remember to mute yourself and unmute yourself when you're answering a question or if you have something to say. And we might be joined by my cat here who is currently walking on my keyboard. So all the fun of doing virtual trainings. Also, if you have a question for today's session, rather than jump in and ask it out of turn, we're going to ask that you submit that question in the chat. If you're not sure, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little hidden bar. Once your cursor scrolls down, it will come up with options like seeing who is a participant in the chat, and in this case, how to open that chat bar. If you're not sure how to chat, feel free to let us know and we will try to walk you through that. We can send private messages to any of you guys. So if you're new to Zoom, don't feel bad. Everybody has a starting point. I think for most of us, this is going to be old hat. So we're going to start by taking attendance. So what I'm going to ask you to do is put your name and your email address in the group chat. Your name and your email address. That is how Becca is going to take attendance. and email you afterwards your next steps for volunteering. Great, thanks guys. Also, if you have a really pressing question that you don't want to wait to have it answered during chat and you really want to get it out in real time, feel free to use the raise your hand feature. If you click on the participants tab, everybody will come up and there at the bottom of the participants, it gives you the option to do some extra things, including raising your hand. You can also do that by hovering over your name. If you guys have questions, feel free to raise your hand during the session. So, also, we understand that we're all adults here. You may have to use the restroom or take a phone call or step away from your computer. Just to make sure we don't accidentally call on you, please type that you're stepping away from your computer so we know. That way we can kind of know who's in the room and can be actively called for answering a question. So those will be our norms. I see lots of people responding in chat. Thank you guys so much. Again, we're going to take attendance by names and email addresses dropping in that chat bar. Okay, so NICE, or Nashville International Center for Empowerment, is a refugee resettlement agency. What that means is that we are actually responsible for bringing refugee families into the country from all over the world. Now, our mission in doing so is to ensure that refugees and immigrants in our community achieve their full potential now and for generations to come. So we don't just serve refugees, we serve asylees and other kinds of immigrants like secondary migrants or people who choose to come into the country in their own volition. So how do we get that mission statement achieved? Well, our agency has a really unique history, and one of the, I would say, recipes for success that we have been gifted with is a really direct communication with the refugee community. We are the only ECBO agency here in Nashville. ECBO stands for Ethnic-Based Community Organization. That means that a majority of our staff and a majority of our board members were refugees at some point. So we love that claim because it means we have a very deep connection to the community. My favorite way of getting students in our ESL program is going to the local sub shop owner who happens to be Burmese and say, you know, hey, give me all your Burmese friends that need to become citizens. And then all of a sudden we have 30 people knocking at the door. You know, we just have those kind of grassroots connections. And one of the reasons that we do is because of the way we were founded. So here in the picture on the left, you'll see our CEO, Dr. Gatlak Thak, and his little brother. This picture was actually taken in a refugee camp in Ethiopia. Both Dr. Gat and his brother were victims of child slave soldiery. So they grew up as child soldiers. They fled from South Sudan during the Sudanese Civil War into Ethiopia, where they lived in the camps for some time. When Dr. Gat was originally vetted and allowed to move into the United States, he was relocated to South Dakota. A little bit of both a culture shock and a weather shock. And so obviously the climate did not suit him or his family, and they eventually moved here to Nashville. But beforehand, Dr. Gat actually put off going to school for himself for many years and worked to support he and his brother. It was only after his brother had gone through all of secondary education that he went back to school and eventually earned his doctorate. So pretty great story. Now it gets even better. You see, Dr. Gat had actually fallen in love with a woman in Ethiopia many years beforehand, and he went back to the camp that he grew up in, found this woman and married her and brought her back into the United States. And they lived together here in Nashville. And it was actually over their kitchen table that he taught his wife English. Well, she was so excited to learn the language that she started to ask Dr. Gat if she could invite her friends. And slowly this group of Sudanese women gathered around their dining room table learning English every night. and they decided together as a couple to form the Sudanese Women's Services Center, which was founded into Sudanese Community and Women's Services Center, founded in 2005. I always struggle with that one. It's kind of a tongue twister. SCWSC. And so they founded that organization in 2005. Later in 2010, it was renamed NICE. And in 2011, we got our first contract to do actual resettlement, to become a resettlement agency. So that's the first time that we brought refugees into the country. And actually, one of the more exciting things to me personally about that is our very first resettlement client is now a staff member with us. She works as a caseworker in one of our departments, helping families decide what they're eligible for public benefits. So she might be enrolling them in cash assistance programs or programs for needy families, SNAP benefits. And so she's been with the agency for a very long time now. But it's kind of great that we have our first client working for us. I always really like that story. In 2019, NICE has expanded all of its services to serve over 25,000 people from 72 different nations all around the world. And every year we're consistently serving over 2,000 people annually. Over half of that service happens in our education department. So last year we had over 1,000 clients come through our doors, 600 of whom were learning English for the first time, 100 of whom became new citizens through our citizenship instruction program, and 250 of whom were youth in the school system who needed intentional support to both understand US-based schooling and to be successful in their pathway toward graduation. So how do we help these 25,000 people? How do we help these 2,000 people annually? Well, we have 6 core programs that, as I said before, provide wraparound services for all of our clients. Now, the first is our resettlement department. Resettlement is actually responsible for everything from the time we get an assurance, or basically a notice that a refugee is to arrive, to their first 90 days. So that's called our resettlement window. Their first 3 months of service is provided by the resettlement department. And that's everything from securing housing, setting up their apartment or home, finding them jobs, helping them learn English as best they can at the beginning of their journey here. And it also includes things like getting health screenings and immunizations for children, enrolling them in school, getting them a social security card. All of those things are included in that process. There's also intense cultural orientation that's built into that process, because we know that really to make it in your first few months, you have to understand the culture that you're living in. We also have employment and health departments, which are both sponsored by the Tennessee Office of Refugees and therefore by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a federal entity within the State Department. So both of those departments are designed to support refugees up to 5 years in the country. For employment, obviously they're helping them get jobs, but it goes much deeper than that. We're doing employability workshops, resume building support. We actually transport people to their first interview. We will take them to an interview, introduce them to the supervisor. We have really great relationships with lots of big employers in Nashville, like O'Reilly, Tyson, FedEx. We also have health services. Now, the way our health department is set up is it's intensive case management. That means we're helping you to enroll in insurance, taking you to the doctor, finding a right physician for you, doing pre-screening, and monitoring your health throughout your time in the first 5 years of your being here. Like I said before, my education department is the biggest. We have a staff of 22 people. We usually get about 100 or more volunteers a year. And those volunteers do everything from assist with interviewing people for practice if they're getting ready for the citizenship interview. You might teach an English class. You might help someone learn the skills to getting their high school diploma, or even support a student after school who's in middle or high school and might need some mentorship opportunities. So our education department does a lot here at NICE, and we're always building fun new initiatives to support those things. Now, in the education department, our goal, just like employment, is economic self-sufficiency. So we're actually sponsored by the labor department, and all of our English classes have a workforce context to them. So we're teaching them employability skills at the same time that we're teaching them basic English literacy. We also have a development team. That's our team responsible for keeping the ship afloat. So they're the ones who are finding and applying to grants, helping us manage those programs, and coordinating with individual, corporate, and other kinds of donors. So they're also responsible for our outreach. So they manage things like PR and social media and communications to other agencies. Um, our last department is the immigration department. So once someone comes in as a refugee, they're given an I-94 that lasts for life. That means they can stay in the US as long as they'd like. But many of our clients still want to go through the process of formal citizenship. It gets them that coveted blue passport, right? So basically what that means is that immigration is the paperwork department. It's where you would file a travel document if you wanted to go overseas, but you still had refugee status. It's where you would apply for your green card once you've been in the country long enough and qualify. It's who would fill out your citizenship application. And we do these services for anyone who qualifies, not just our clients. Are there any questions about these programs specifically before we move forward? Okay, and Becca, feel free to interrupt me if you see anything in the chat that you want to cover.
Will do.
Great. I have somehow hidden my chat bar, which is why I'm, there we go, okay.
Gotcha. So far, no questions have come through. Thank you,
Perfect.
everyone, for putting your emails and names in there. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so before I actually go into the answer to this question, does anyone know the difference between a refugee, an asylee, and an immigrant? You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself, pop right in. What is a refugee versus an asylee, or the general designation of an immigrant?
I'll try to take a stab at it.
Go for it.
Okay, so a refugee is if you're in a country with like a war or another large displacement. And then I think the UN or another international organization designates you to have refugee status, and you can apply to other countries to come live. And then asylees are people seeking asylum in a specific country from a threat in their own country, like religious intolerance or gender discrimination. And then an immigrant is just someone who is wanting to come to a different country.
Yeah, that's a really great summary. Is it Willa or Villa?
It's Willa.
Willa, awesome. That's a great summary. So basically the big difference between the three is how you earn your designation. So just like you were saying, if someone is a refugee, that means that the entire international community has recognized a reason for you to be protected. It's a little more stable than an asylum status, because once you earn that designation for your people group, you can't lose it very easily. So UNHCR is the entity responsible for recognizing and housing and protecting refugees during their first stage of flight. So that stands for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And they define a refugee as a person who flees his or her country and is unwilling or unable to return due to a well-founded fear. Now, well-founded fear is actually a technical term in this sense, and it basically means that you are afraid for your life for one of many designated reasons. So the list includes persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or for your political opinion. There can be a little bit of overlap in those last two. Oftentimes, being a member of a social group in certain countries might carry the weight of a particular political opinion. So for example, we had a case, a client from Venezuela who is actually an asylee, but the rules are pretty similar in the US for that list. And they basically were in a social group that had become a political party that was being persecuted by Maduro. And we were able to help them apply for asylum status, and their case was actually approved. We don't do that very often, but we were really glad, mostly because it's very difficult to get an asylum case approved. And so we don't want our clients to feel misled that we are guaranteeing them a service. But we will support people in really desperate situations, so to speak. So an asylee, on the other hand, is someone who crosses a political border, like the border between Mexico and the United States, puts up their hands and says to the local government, I need protection, right? Every country has their different policies for accepting asylees. In the United States right now, when an asylee enters the country and asks for asylum, they're actually detained in a facility until their case can be heard. And sometimes that's up to several months of being basically imprisoned until they can have their case heard in front of an immigration judge. And that immigration judge actually has full authority without needing any kind of approval to approve or deny those cases. Now, the idea is that an asylum case only gets approved if there's a lot of evidence to support a well-founded fear. So you might need documentation of things like death threats, for example. It's not an easy thing to file for asylum. And I won't go into too much more detail than that. But the big difference is that you're asking a local country, a government of the country you've entered, to support you directly rather than looking to the international landscape for support, like Willow was saying. And then in this context, we're going to refer to immigrants as people who choose to relocate of their own volition without a push factor, like these other two groups might have. So I have some data here for you. I also always pull up the year-to-date numbers from UNHCR's website that I have over here. So I'm actually going to stop sharing this screen for just a second and pull you guys over to the most recent data as of this morning. So as of today, because this gets updated pretty regularly, so as of June 18th rather, 79.5 million people all around the world are forcibly displaced from their homes. That might be because they're being targeted by their government. It might be that there's a civil war in their area. It might be that political boundaries that were drawn up by someone other than a native person were drawn in a way that marginalized someone and created political conflict, as in the case of Myanmar. There's two territories in Myanmar that are not considered by the government to be part of the country, and yet the political boundaries are drawn around them. And that's basically what is the crux of the issue behind the Rohingya crisis. Now, it doesn't hurt that they are also conservative Muslims being targeted by their government, as is the case in a lot of these situations. So of those 79.5 million forcibly displaced people, 26 million of those are refugees. 45.7 are internally displaced persons. That means that they're still living in their home country, but that they don't really have the right to own property, vote, or be counted as a citizen. And that's really the case for people in that situation with those political boundaries being drawn incorrectly, or maybe there's some kind of civil war that has forced a social group or a kind of ethnic group in a territory to not be recognized by the government. 4.2 million people all around the world are asylum seekers right now, and 3.6 million Venezuelans are currently displaced outside of their country. That's a huge number, and it's growing very frequently. We have a lot of Venezuelan asylum seekers that come into the United States. We also have a lot of undocumented people living in the United States who are from Venezuela who can't get status. Their options are to go to Peru, where there's a refugee camp, or to go to Colombia, where there's a refugee camp. But in the case of Peru, the Peruvians are very discriminatory against the Venezuelans, and they often get death threats or fear of persecution there in their host country. And then Colombia really lacks the stability to be a viable refugee center. And so there's a lot of challenges with that as well. So a lot of people try to cross borders on their own and end up taking great risks to do so. 1% of the entire world's population is actually forcibly displaced from their homes. 80% of dislocated people are in countries or territories that are affected by food insecurity or malnutrition. 73% of the world's refugee population and displaced persons population are hosted in neighboring countries. One of the challenges with that is that those countries often are developing countries. So 85% of displaced people are hosted in developing countries. A really good example of that is Syrians. Syrian refugees typically end up in Jordan, and Jordan doesn't even have the money to pay for their own educational infrastructure, let alone try to accommodate a refugee crisis. And so what ends up happening is those people end up in Turkey over time, but it takes a long time to get there. And in the meantime, they often have no access to education or very little access to high quality education for the school age children. Okay. Fun things. Let me switch back over to my slide here. And you guys can see a little bit how those numbers ebb and flow. So basically, on this slide, if you look here, only 92,400 refugees of those 80,000 people displaced, 80 million people displaced, are resettled. So that's a fraction of a percent. That means that most refugees don't get resettled. They don't get a permanent sense of home. And it means that they're either turned over to a different option or waiting in limbo for a very long time. And it's the waiting in limbo and being resettled that we're going to talk about today. But please understand, this doesn't happen for all of our refugees. Most refugees never get this opportunity. And so the people that do are incredibly grateful for being here. These are some statistics specifically about resettlement here in the US. So we are not the only country that accepts refugees as host country, right? And in fact, our numbers have ebbed and flowed a lot in who we accept. So as of 2015, we were bringing in roughly 82,000 people. Now, if you'll notice, the dark blue line is submissions, the light blue line is resettlement departures. So basically, every year, the President of the United States makes a determination of how many people we can accommodate from this pool of refugees every year. It's called the presidential determination. And in 2015, we agreed to accommodate 85,000 people. Now, that doesn't mean there are 85,000 people with their hands up that can just walk right in the country, right? There's a process for this. So UNHCR reviews all of the cases and basically assigns them to host countries. So we were assigned 82,491 applicants that the UN said these would be good cases for the United States. Of those, only 52,583 actually made it into the country. Now, part of that is because of the vetting process. Things can come up during the background checks, which eliminate you from qualification. It might be that you get sick, and so you have a health concern that keeps you from entering the country. It could be any number of reasons. It might even be that you missed your flight and they won't schedule you another one, and so you get put in next year's numbers. So those kinds of things are all contributing factors to that gap. In 2016, the refugee program was the largest that it's ever been in US history. We had a presidential determination of 115,000. We received 108,000 submissions from the UNHCR. we resettled 78,761 people. And then in 2017, new leadership, new rules, that number drastically changed, right? So in 2017, we basically said as a country, we're only going to accept 30,000 people. At that point, it was a historic low for the program. You can see we received 26,782 applications. Of those, we resettled the majority of the cases we said we would, right? We actually improved that year what percentage of the cases actually came into the United States, right? The next year, the resettlement figure stayed the same. We were able to get more applications, but we actually resettled fewer of those people. One of the reasons between 2016, 2017, 2018, there's a decline is the travel ban, right? So we'll talk a little bit about how that first round of travel bans affected this refugee pipeline and drastically changed things between 2015, 2016, 2017. And then in 2019, our presidential determination was only 25,000 people. And of those, 19,847 actually got brought into the country. This year's numbers for 2020 are 14,000. That is our presidential determination. And there's a ton of stipulations involved. There's a whole group. So basically, instead of just saying, these are the people we're going to accept, the determination this year was broken down into categories. We're going to accept this many special immigration visas. We're going to accept this many people from these countries. And one of the big groups of people is actually from a small area in the Pacific realm where there's no UNHCR infrastructure. So we've committed to resettling people we don't even have contact with. So basically that eliminates a huge number of that 14,000 from actually being a viable number, right? So that's one way that that number has kind of been manipulated to be even lower than it looks like on paper. Here's a few statistics about resettlement between 2016 and 2017. So one of the really interesting things is it used to be the case that about 3/4 of our arrivals had a US tie. What that means is someone living here in the United States who is willing to sponsor a family. So it might be a relative, it might be a friend, but they're basically putting on paper in a federally admissible document that they take responsibility for the client. That means if the client ever becomes homeless, they take financial responsibility of them. So there's all kinds of implications for this. It is becoming increasingly more difficult to get into the US without a US tie. So in 2017, the number was 95% of cases had a US tie. That's because cases that didn't were basically thrown out. And I guarantee you that number's only getting closer to 100%. And actually, I believe last year nominally it was 100%. Another big change between these 2 years, as I said before, is the effect of that travel ban. So on the left side of the screen, you can see we were resettling from countries like Sudan, Somalia, Syria. We're not resettling from any of those anymore because they're Muslim majority countries. Well, not Sudan, but the thing about Sudan is Christianity in Sudan is still heavily influenced by conservative Islam, and so it's still seen as threatening. There's also a shift between where we're resettling predominantly. So if you notice on the left side of the screen, 36% of clients in 2017 came out of DRC. Last year, it was more like 90%. So at least for us here in Tennessee. So we're seeing a lot more clients from Democratic Republic of Congo. We're seeing clients we've seen some Ethiopian clients, not many. We see a lot of clients from Burma still, but it's not the Rohingya. It's mostly Zomi or Karen. And Karen is a Christian group that lives in Burma, so that also plays a factor. You'll notice that there's still a pretty prevalent number of Iraqi new arrivals in 2017. That's predominantly because of the effects of the Iraq War. So a lot of the people who are resettled are SIVs, or special immigration visas. And basically that means they served during the war um, in the US military. So we have someone on staff, for example, who's from Iraq. He identifies as Kurdish, and he served as a translator in the war, came in as a special immigration visa. So we still get some of those cases. We did resettle last year a couple from Russia, which is kind of odd, but it does happen, basically because of Nuremberg laws. Well, that's my understanding. We were seeing people from El Salvador and Honduras. We haven't seen as many cases from those countries coming into Nashville, even though they're still hitting the US. Down here in red, you can see our personal numbers. So in 2016, NICE resettled 287 clients. In 2019, we resettled 194. So we actually came back last year a little bit. Most of that is just, it's all business. It's all bureaucracy, right? So we were able to resettle more people than we were actually designated. We were told we would have 170 cases, and we got closer to 200. It just depends on how they assign the cases. This year, we were only slotted to receive 80 people. And because of the pandemic, we will probably receive that or less. So we're going to go right into the journey of a refugee. And this may be old hat for some of you and new information for others. I really like doing this during our volunteer orientation because it gives you a very clear picture of all the ins and outs of this process. And to me, that is so vital for understanding our client base. So the first thing that happens is a refugee flees home. And I'm sure you've all heard stories and had to think about this. You know, it's that middle of the night, take what you can, let's go on the lam kind of thinking. That's not always how this happens, but it does happen to a lot of our clients. In the journey of fleeing, in the process of fleeing, a lot of people are injured. They get separated from their family members. They get separated from their children. It's a very traumatic process. The resettlement process refers, in this case, to their time in the camps. So once refugees leave their country, if they make it to a refugee camp, they're given temporary housing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that resettlement process, but does anybody have a guess as to how long the average refugee lives in temporary housing inside a camp before they are designated for resettlement?
We have a guess in the chat, or an answer in the chat.
Okay, what does it say?
1 year from Claire McDonald.
Okay. So does anybody, you can raise your hand, you can push your reaction to raise your hand. Does anybody think it's 1 to 5 years? Who thinks 5 to 10? Okay, I see some hands. 10 to 15? So the average refugee actually spends an average of 20 years in a resettlement camp. That is the case. So it's, that number is basically associated with the primary on the case. So if I went into, for example, Tanzania, and I actually know a client for whom this applies. His family moved to Tanzania. He was 5 years old when he arrived. He was 25 when he got into the US. So he spent 20 years growing up in a camp. Most of our clients are women and children. The children obviously don't spend 20 years in camp. They're born in camp. So a lot of the times on their travel documents, you'll see their nationality listed as Congo/Burundi. Well, that means they're Congolese by nationality, but they were actually born in Burundi because they were born in camp. Now, preparation and arrival is the process of finding out you've been approved and having to pack your things and get ready for that plane. So basically what happens is a family who's lived effectively 20 years in a camp, gets a week's notice. We get 2 weeks notice. So we get a form that says, Becca has been approved to come into the United States. Can you accept them? And we basically guarantee that we can receive Becca, that we have the resources. And so because we, the process hinges on us saying, yes, we can take them, they don't want to get the family's hopes up. The family doesn't find out until after we do. So we get 2 weeks notice to find them an apartment, set it up, and get all of their paperwork in order so that when they get here, we can hit the ground running in that 30-day process. They get a week and they're told, sell all your possessions, pack what you can, your plane is leaving this day. And basically there's a health check right before they leave. And if they don't pass that health screening, even though they've sold all of their things off, they have to start the whole process over again. Now, it won't take 20 years, but it might take months. And they just sold all of their things. So it's not an ideal situation, and there's a lot of care that has to go in at every level of this to make it even somewhat effective. So after a refugee flees from home, basically, they pack their things, they leave their home, they run away. There's 3 options of what might happen to them. One is called local integration. So local integration is a refugee who flees into a country and then decides to live in that country. So a lot of Rohingya decide to live in Bangladesh, and they get citizenship in Bangladesh. And the local government allows that. In Jordan, this happens too. The resources in Jordan are really spotty, so a lot of people choose, if they can, to go to Turkey. Another good example would be that there are some Congolese who end up living permanently in Burundi, Tanzania, or Malawi, right? The other option is called voluntary repatriation. So let's say that there's a civil war going on, someone leaves their home country, and the war ends. They might choose, because again, they've been in camp 10, 15 years, if the war is gone and the country's restabilized, they might choose to go home on their own. So that's called voluntary repatriation. The other option is resettlement, which is where you actually get designated to a host country, get on a plane, fly to somewhere new. This only happens to less than 1% of the population of refugees. It's very uncommon.
Before we move on, Brandon, we have a question in the chat.
Great.
What factors determine who gets an opportunity to resettle and who doesn't?
Yeah, it's this screening process. So anyone that we might think could be associated with radicalism or doesn't fit the bill of a perfect resettlement candidate for whatever reason. It could be that they have really bad health issues and the country doesn't want to take responsibility for that. There's all kinds of reasons that might weed you out from being qualified. And basically the process starts when you get to camp. The whole screening process for a foreign government happens overseas. So you don't get to come into the country, be screened, and then sent back, right? So we actually have a presence in camps all over the world. The UNHCR begins the process, and it usually takes about 18 months to 3 years to be screened. So you're actually being vetted for 3 years in most cases. Now, what happens is the UN does their vetting process and then decides, okay, based on these factors and the political climate of these countries, we feel like you would be best suited to move to New Zealand, for example, or the United Kingdom, or Turkey. At that point, the government of the country you're submitted an application to gets to step in and vet your process. So in the United States, when we receive a recommendation to host a refugee, they go through an intensive background check process. 8 US government agencies are involved in this process. And basically, it includes running background checks, going through security databases, and 3 in-person interviews. And if there's anything that you say they don't like in those interviews, they're going to kick your application out. And you may not get referred to another host country. So this is sort of similar to the citizenship interview. So they're asking questions that are kind of designed to see if you would fit well in the US system. So they might ask someone if they have multiple wives. If they say yes or no, it could have a serious impact on their application, right? And because it could have a serious implication on their application, it could have a very negative impact on them being resettled at all. Does that kind of answer the question? There's a lot of different reasons. And I'm sure that even if I tried to name all of them, there are some I wouldn't even begin to think about. It's really subjective, and it's up to those government officials to really decide what, there's a lot of autonomy in the way you can vet those people. So there is a video that we normally watch during the volunteer orientation. What I'll do is I'll just give you guys some highlights, and then we can send this out as a link later so that you're not just watching my screen watch a video. We might have audio issues at that point. But this video was created by Secretary of State Jay Johnson, or Secretary of Defense, sorry. And it highlights a hypothetical family whose the mother's name is Rima, and it goes through her journey. And again, it's a hypothetical, but it just talks about the fact that the majority of refugees that come into the country are women and children fleeing war. It talks about the security measures that they go through, and then it talks about why basically we want to keep doing this program. And it's a really heartwarming video. It talks about Elie Wiesel, and it talks a little bit about Albert Einstein and some refugee athletes. And basically, you know, why do we, with all the trouble that it's worth and all the time that it takes, why do we feel it's valuable to resettle refugees? Well, you know, basically because human life matters. And this video talks a lot about how refugees enhance the world in which they live in a way we can't deny. And so we have a moral obligation on one hand to bring people in who are suffering from violent extremism. And on the other hand, we have an economic and personal gain that is given to us by having these people in our local community. It's a really great video. And like I said, I will send it out to you guys afterwards. So let's talk about that 1% for a minute, the refugees who actually get resettled. This is a great process that all starts when a refugee family gets selected. There are some things that are really challenging about it. We love being a part of this. I will say it is a little heartwarming. It is a little hard to hear some of the challenges that are built into this system. So basically what happens is a refugee gets interviewed by Department of Homeland Security, and that official determines that they're eligible to come into the country. So that's sort of like their last in-person interview, right? Once they're approved, the resettlement process and their placement begins. So there are 10 entities all across the United States called VOLAGs, or volunteer agencies. And basically those VOLAGs are responsible for receiving cases. So you might get a case as a VOLAG, and then you have to look at the whole United States map and decide, where would I put this person, right? And the factors that get considered are the language that they speak. Are there other people of the same ethnic background and nationality of this person? Will they have a sense of community? Will they have the resources needed to provide for their journey, right? Because it takes a lot of things like social services and volunteer groups on the ground to really help successful US integration. So in Tennessee, the majority of refugees end up going to Knoxville, Nashville, Chattanooga, Memphis. They're not going to end up as a resettlement in, let's say, Mount Juliet, right? Because the resources are here in Davidson County. The agencies that would best provide for them are in Davidson County. So a lot of the metropolitan area is chosen for that reason. Now, we actually belong to the VOLAG ECDC, which stands for the Ethiopian Community Development Council. And it was originally established for the purpose of resettling Ethiopian people and South Sudanese people living in Ethiopia. But now it's grown to, be just as big as some of the other VOLAGs. It's not the biggest by any means. Now, once a case gets assigned to that VOLAG, the VOLAG decides which of their resettlement sites to send a person. So we are one among many of ECDC's resettlement agencies. Now, there are 2 resettlement agencies here in Tennessee, Catholic Charities and NICE. World Relief did have a presence in Nashville until 2016 when those numbers got so cut back, we just didn't have enough clients to support 3 agencies in the same area. Now, they still do have a presence in Memphis. So World Relief still exists. They're still a partner of ours. Once they're assigned to a resettlement site like ours, we get notice that they're coming. We sign that assurance. And again, that refugee is the last person to know. What ends up happening is they go into their last stage of arrival. They do a medical exam. They go through processing. There might be some other clearance checks involved. If there are medical implications or complications rather, they're put on hold. We did have this happen to a family of 7 last year. We weren't ever really sure what the medical complication was, but they didn't end up being resettled in Nashville at all. So I don't know if they'll be further down the pipeline or if they got sent to a different resettlement agency. Now, this is what we're really responsible for. So UNHCR and the International Office of Migration will book the flight for the client. We get notification, usually 1 to 2 weeks ahead of time, and that's when our caseworkers hit the ground. Once a caseworker is assigned to the case, they're responsible for finding them an apartment, making sure that apartment has furniture in it by the time they get here, and that their pantry is fully stocked with food so that they have everything they need for their first couple of days without having to go to the store and navigate all that new environment, right? That's also a time when we start to schedule things like cultural orientation and start booking health appointments before they're even in the country, because we can't really do any pre-work, but we try to do as much as we can. The last step is that the refugee actually shows up at the airport. And so we actually use volunteers and caseworkers to drive our company van over to the airport and pick up big families of people who come into the country for the first time. Now, if you remember, 95 to nominally 100% of our cases have a U.S. tie, which means usually this is a big family reunion. So we end up taking both vans usually. There might be 3 people from the family who's already in the United States picking up a family of 7 people. And so we just stock all the vans with their luggage and have a big party essentially as we get them moved in. It's a really fun thing to be a part of a pickup. It's a really fun thing to be a part of a move-in. Now, basically, once that person is moved in, that really starts the clock. They have 90 days after their arrival where they're on basically this government subsidy program where they get a caseworker. So we have to close the case in 90 days. There's all sorts of things that have to happen in that time period. We have to get them a social security number, right? We've got to get them an ID. We've got to get their immunizations from the health department. We might try to find them we definitely need to find them employment. We try to get them as much English as possible. We teach them the ins and outs of our healthcare system, the ins and outs of our cultural community. And basically after that, in the government's mind, that's all the support that you need. Now, we continue providing for our clients in creative ways, like our family mentorship program. But what happens from a government standpoint is once the refugees are here for 90 days, they start getting bills for their plane ticket because their plane ticket is not free. It's just been paid for temporarily by IOM. And if you're coming out of somewhere like Bhutan, that's probably a $1,200 plane ticket per family member. So for a family of 5, you're talking about a $7,000 bill that they start receiving collection on 3 months into being here. It can be a really hard thing. There are deferment programs for that And what we do is we have a whole department as part of our resettlement process that handles eligibility. So what kind of loan forgiveness programs might you qualify for? What kind of deferment might you qualify for? Can you qualify for what's called RCA? So RCA stands for Refugee Cash Assistance. And a refugee can qualify for cash assistance programs for up to 8 months, but they must still pay their plane ticket back unless they qualify for deferral. At this point in our agency, we try to enroll them in all the other programs that we can so that we're still serving that family. And the goal overall of all of our programs is for the family to achieve economic and cultural self-sufficiency. So this is a lot we just went through. I'm going to take a breath and just see if we have any questions. It looks like there's a couple. But if you guys are, thinking of anything related to this, now's a great chance to kind of chime in before we move forward.
Claire, did that answer your question, or did you have more on that?
No, that was my question, is kind of like, where do the furniture, the food, the things you're providing for them, where do you get those things?
Yeah, so every refugee family has a cash stipend associated with their resettlement period. So basically the case gets a certain amount of money and we hold on to that for the family. Some of it is given out as like a stipend monthly so they can buy things for themselves, but most of it's used to cut the checks for their rent, their utilities, and help them get food. A lot of our families in their first 90 days will qualify for SNAP. Just because of their case size. Again, this is mostly women and children, right? For those that don't, we do get a lot of donations. We work with groups like Mother to Mother who sponsor diapers for our refugee clients so that moms who have babies or infants don't have to go out and spend a majority of their stipend on those kind of things. We do get furniture donations. The only thing we won't accept is beds, just because that's murky territory for anybody. So there are some things we have to pay for. I'll also tell you guys, one of the first questions we get asked by ECDC is, we know this is not enough money. What are you guys going to do to make it up? And so we have a ton of programs that support resettlement. We can't really get grants to do this program because it is a federally provided program. But what we can do is put individual and corporate donations towards this program. And we can put foundation grants towards our other wraparound services that can pick these clients up afterwards. All right, so if we don't have any other questions.
Wait, I do. I'm so
go right
sorry.
ahead, Amy. Yeah, no problem.
I'm so sorry. If you guys see me like turning my phone around, I don't have this app on my computer, and I'm terrible at working with this phone. Anyway, my question to you is, so do they, in the very beginning of the process, you said there are typically like 3 options. So they, like the local integration, they go back home, or resettlement.
Sure.
Do they get to choose what they want, or are they told?
Yeah, so local integration and voluntary repatriation are a choice. Now, it's not necessarily an open choice because refugees understand, they're kind of told in the process that it's not likely, 99% of them will not get resettled. So they have to make that informed decision for themselves. Now, if they go through the process of being vetted for resettlement and they get rejected, then they have to make a choice between those other options. So it may not be an open decision. It's not made in a vacuum, right?
Got it.
No refugee gets to choose resettlement.
Okay.
They all sort of apply for it, and the majority don't get it.
Okay. And I have one more question.
Yeah, please.
This might be like an ignorant question, but so once they arrive back here, they have to start paying back their plane ticket and whatever other costs were loaned to them. So did you say they had like around 6 months for that?
They have,
start paying it back?
They have 90 days. They have 3 months where they're not accruing interest and they're not being billed for their plane ticket. Now you can get on like repayment plans and pay that over time, but you're still going to start getting a bill for a massive amount of money. And without the right kind of financial training or context, it might be the case that you don't know it all at once, right?
Sure.
So it can be a pretty intimidating process, but you do have a little bit of liberty in how it gets repaid.
Okay.
But if you don't pay it all back up front, it will gain interest. It's just like any loan.
Okay. And so for people that are like refugees or taking all of our jobs, like obviously we know, like we see the struggle, like they have 3 months to start paying that stuff back. And do they have to like get a job within that 3 months and learn a new language?
Yeah,
Like
basically, that's a really
how?
great question. So we have goals for our program for um, what's called economic self-sufficiency as a metric of our program success, right? So our employment department is tasked with getting the new arrivals work. And so basically, we try to get them employment as quickly as we can, which is
Of
why so many of
course.
them end up in places like Tyson, because Tyson will let us hire 30 people at a time.
Oh, wow.
We took vans to Vanderbilt once and had 21 people employed at Vanderbilt's groundskeeping in one day. So this is not the process of getting a career started. This is the process of getting a job. Um, if you have a disability or you are a single parent, you might have an exemption from getting employment, but otherwise you're required to find work in that
Okay.
time.
Okay, got it. Wow. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Faye, I see your hand up.
I don't know why this never occurred to me, but do you have to get a screening in order to get into the refugee camp to begin with?
That's a great question. So basically what happens when you show up at camp is you go through a processing with the International Office of Migration, and you have to show any paperwork that you might have. There is a little bit of a vetting, and they might turn you away. It's not very common for that to happen. The more common thing is because you left in a hurry, you don't have documented evidence of who you are, and so IOM will like create an identity for you, which is really uncomfortable. That's why you see a lot of our clients will have the birthday January 1st. That birthday is assigned to them by IOM because they don't have any documentation of their actual birthday. So Dr. Gap, for example, his birthday is January 1st. We have seen all sorts of things from a client whose name is listed as FNU, which is just an acronym for first name unknown, to a creative IOM officer giving a name. So we had 2 clients who were minors, they were children, and one of them was named phonetically 1A, and the other one was named 2B, but it was TOOBE. Yeah, so it's all up to that IOM officer to let you in the door, assign your identity to you, figure out what your birthday would be, and get you basically your first paper document. Because if you're coming from if you're a Rohingya culturally living in Myanmar, you're not recognized by your government at all, and it's the government who's coming in the middle of the night and burning your house down. Sorry, you guys. It's the government. Hey, stop that. Come here. It's the government who comes in the middle of the night and burns your house down. So why would they keep a written record of you? So a lot of these people have no documentation until IOM creates it for them. But I'm not familiar with a percentage of people that just get turned away from the camps. The groups that usually run the camps are the UNHCR, UNICEF, and local NGOs that might be supporting those international organizations. Typically, they want people to succeed in getting in, right? And I think that IOM, including that one loan officer that named a child Tubi, they basically have the right idea in mind. It's just the execution can be really daunting because there's so many people. I mean, you're talking about camps of in Bangladesh, some of those camps are 2-3 million people. And you're getting 1,300 a day. So I can understand why you would want to push the process along a little bit, even if it's really less than ideal from our lens. So great question, Faye. Otto, did I see your hand up too, or was that just my screen?
No, I don't really have a question right now. You've covered a lot of it.
Okay, awesome. Kimberly.
Yes. So I know you mentioned, that a lot of these refugees and stuff are women and children. I'm kind of wondering what's happening to the men. I know some babies are being born while they're being, waiting that 20 years.
Yeah, that's a
I'm
great
kind of wondering
question.
what's happening.
It's not exclusively women and children. What will happen sometimes is you'll get a case of one, and then you'll get the follow-up case of 7, right? So you'll have an unaccompanied husband, and then the wife and kids will come later. Typically, it's just that there just happens to be an outnumbering. It could be in some areas civil war. If men are transcripted or forced into the military at a more frequent rate, that could play a part of it. I know in some situations, and I don't really want to get into too much detail about this, men are a little more at risk for being targeted. So we have several clients really, and staff members who we know the male head of household was executed by the government or targeted by local militia. So that happens at a more frequent rate than with the women in the community. And so they're the ones that are, I guess, more likely to get away. That's kind of a difficult answer, but that's a part of it for sure.
Thank you.
Guys, I'm going to just step away from my computer for just a second to turn a light on because I realized that my room is getting kind of dim. Hold on one second. I have all my unlikely coworkers with me today. My cat kept walking across my computer, so there he is, chilling. And you might hear the dog bark a little bit in the background. She can't see so well anymore, so if she sees something come by the house, she's going to start acting up. So basically, in this process of resettlement, you can imagine at every step, there is trauma. There are traumatic experiences. And we talk about this as the triple trauma paradigm. Basically because when you abandon your home and run away from what you're used to, that's traumatic, right? So you have this trauma that you get from your country of origin, you have this trauma of escape, and then you have this trauma of relocation. So we're going to talk about each one of those really briefly. So the trauma of country of origin is, why are you being persecuted in the first place, right? What's going on? What's the push factor that's leading you to leave your home? So it might be that you're being oppressed or discriminated against, that you're being actively persecuted, that you're getting physical threats, or that there's an ongoing war. All of those things are a context that breeds a lot of trauma. In addition to that, you have this idea of the trauma of escape. So a lot of our clients were forced to leave everything that they knew, family members, their culture, their home, their possessions. You might also have physical obstacles on your journey, like weather or terrain or lack of shelter. Especially if, well, there are a lot of things that can happen in a journey of escape, right? You might also have crimes committed against you along the way that you have no power to speak up against, whether it's being ripped off by someone who's smuggling you out of the country, who wants all your money because you don't have an option otherwise, or it might be something as traumatic as sexual abuse, which does happen in this process. There are a number of things that cause this to be a very traumatic part of the journey. And a lot of us think, okay, they're here now, they're safe, they have a new life, they're rebuilding. But there's also trauma relatively built into the process of relocating, right? So you're in a new environment where you don't have those things we talked about before. You don't have your family, your culture, the things that you're used to. Everything is new. The grocery stores are new. The post office is new. The way you check out books from the library is new, because guess what they don't have in Tanzania? They don't have libraries like we do, right? At least not anywhere near the same. And a lot of the school-age children, for example, that we work with, all of the camps have school outside. So if it rains, there's no class. There is no such thing as mandatory participation. So truancy is new to these families as well, right? The idea that they have to go to school every day, rain, snow, or whatever. Maybe not snow in Tennessee, because usually we'll cancel for a flurry, but you get the idea. It's all very foreign. And so you have this adjustment period. The new language, the new culture, new surroundings can be a huge shock for people. And we don't always help that process because we have a timeline to get cultural orientation done and get you to the doctor. And there's almost this sense of like, we got to hurry, hurry, hurry to get you through this. And, in this entire process, there are ebbs and flows in the political climate and rhetoric of how the families are being welcomed here in Tennessee. You might remember that back in December, the law was changed so that individual states had to basically raise their hand and say, we want to resettle refugees. And if they didn't actively do that, their default position was going to be not receiving people. So governors, mayors, and local officials at every level had to stand up and say, yes, we're willing to participate in this process. And a lot of people opted out, right? Now, we were lucky enough that NICE and Turk and some other agencies here in our community partnered with refugee sites all across Tennessee. We met with Governor Bill Lee. We met with Mayor Briley. We met with Mayor Cooper, sorry. And we made sure that the decision was made to keep Tennessee a welcoming state. Well, I don't know how many of you watched the news, but not long after that decision was made, local state senators tried to have it overturned. And as a result, several counties that surround Davidson actually put into law that refugees were not allowed to live in those areas. And so there's a lot of backlash along with momentum. And so political climate can be very intimidating to a new family who may or may not feel welcome. Another part of this is that along the process, they may not have access to mental health services. Even beyond access, they may have cultural stigmas preventing them from looking for mental health services, right? So a lot of our clients don't want mental health care. They don't want to receive counseling because there's a cultural stigma against it. And that can be a huge burden to helping people unpack these traumatic experiences and helping them heal. So because of all that trauma, because of the weight of this journey, we have to be really aware and considerate of what our clients have been through. So NICE, we talk a lot about cultural awareness. We have an obligation to let all of our staff and our volunteers know that our client base is diverse, not just in culture, but in religion. And we have to ask that everyone be as respectful and understanding as possible. Part of your volunteer experience might be getting in a Zoom call with a family, which means, you need to be careful about the clothing that you're wearing, the behavior that you're exhibiting, because it might not be offensive to your eye, but it might be offensive to a new family who's undergone a lot of pressure, a lot of trauma, and feels unsettled or maybe unwelcome. We have had cases where Muslim families felt like some of our volunteers were pressuring them religiously. Now, the volunteers didn't feel that way because it wasn't their intention. So I love the idea of sharing our stories with our clients, sharing our faith with our clients, and helping unpack our own personal history and beliefs. It's really rewarding to sit around the table and exchange ideas with people, especially once they warm up to you. I think one of the things that we always want to remind our volunteers is that we are not a faith-based agency. And so we have to be really careful about this distinction between sharing your personal history and your story as a way of accessing some kind of relationship building, which is really powerful, and proselytizing, trying to recruit or change people's opinions can be really intimidating. And a lot of our clients, because of their trauma, are hyper vigilant. And that just means that in the way that their brain is developed, they tend to be more sensitive to certain things than anyone else. And so, the core of their brain is hyperactive all the time and basically sends them into flight, fight, or other responses which might be detrimental to relationship building. So when we feel like we're being really careful about sharing and asking for shares, they might feel like we're being invasive. And so we have to be really responsive to that. I have run the education department now for 2 years, and I've seen some really weird things. I've seen a lot of our Somali clients don't like to be on camera. They don't like their picture taken. But one time we had a Japanese news network come and do a video filmed news piece, and they all wanted to be in the video. And I'm like, really? And they loved it, you know, and a lot of our clients want to open up and share their story, and they'll tell you just about anything, sometimes too much about their story, right? So I don't say this to intimidate you about getting to know the clients. It is so rewarding, and most likely they're going to jump in and want to tell you all about what they've been through, especially if you as a volunteer are consistent and present and responsive. So one of the really important things that I bring up all of this traumatic history to say is, you know, we count on volunteers to help our programs run smoothly, and our clients therefore count on volunteers. So being on time to things, being there routinely, being emotionally available is huge for this population. Now, that being said, we don't just offer opportunities where you're with a client and exposed emotionally, right? You might be a person who that terrifies. We've got plenty of opportunities for our volunteers to support in the background of the work that we do, whether it's filing paperwork or helping make copies. We've got administrative tasks that can be done, helping take attendance for our classes. There's a lot of ways you can support, but there's also a ton of ways where you can get directly involved with families. I'm going to talk a little bit about those, but before we do, I just want to tell you a little bit about the process of becoming a volunteer. How are we doing on time? Yeah, we're going to be great. So basically, everybody here should have completed an online application. If you haven't, Becca's going to go through the email call that you put into chat at the beginning. So if you don't put your email, you might get missed. Make sure, name an email in the chat. And basically, if anybody doesn't have an online application, she's going to poke you a little bit and say, hey, I need you to fill this form out, right? Once we have that application, it's really the start of the process. Attending a volunteer orientation is the second step. You guys are already there. Congratulations. You're halfway through. Basically, this process is a chance for us to unpack our client base and tell you our opportunities and get you prepared to really get your hands dirty. After this, we will give you a placement decision. Now, the majority of our volunteers end up in the education department. It's one of the reasons why I'm leading this training, right? But we have opportunities in our education department, our employment department, our health department, eligibility. A lot of those spaces are changing. Their needs have adapted to virtual service delivery, which makes it sometimes difficult for volunteers to be helpful. But I can tell you guys, all of our classes are still happening online. So if you're interested in teaching English to a family who's learning for the first time, it's a great time to do it. If you're interested in meeting with young people and being a mentor for them, even though you're not in the same room with them, it's a great time to do it. There are plenty of opportunities, and we will find a way to get every one of you guys connected with what we do. One way or another. That's Becca's new job, is being creative about how we can get you through the door. Now, once we place you, and the next two steps kind of happen in tandem, we're going to ask you to fill a background check out and say, okay, Becca, you've come to orientation, fill this form out. Once it comes back to me, I'll introduce you to your department head, who's going to be facilitating your volunteer experience. And if there's any further training, Becca's going to schedule that for you. So if you're interested in becoming an adult ESL teacher or working with our citizenship or high school diploma program, there's a follow-up training that we'll do in Zoom just like this. It'll be a little shorter and a lot meatier in terms of how that department works. And we will give you all the resources that you need to effectively teach someone to learn English for the first time. If you're interested in working with our youth program, there's also a follow-up training. If you want to be an employment volunteer, we're going to match you with an employment representative, and they're going to teach you as you go. So there's a lot of different ways that placement phase can kind of play out, and you may be required to attend some further training. Once we have that background check and you're placed within a specific role in the agency, then basically what you're going to do is volunteer. And as you volunteer, we're going to ask that you log your hours. Now, who's familiar with the way that grants work? Anybody? Okay, I see a couple hands. So one of the things that's really common for a grant is that the agency has to match the investment of the donor, right? So one of the ways we can do that is with volunteer hours. Guys, if everybody went into Track It Forward every time they volunteered and logged their hours, I could have all the match finished for the whole year and not have to touch any of our other resources. That's how many volunteers we have and how valuable your time is. Because we estimate that time based on either your income or what we would pay someone to do that job. And those hours stack up really quickly. That's pivotal. But too often than not, people don't choose to fill this time out, and then it means we can't claim those hours. If you're here for a class at school that you need credit for, you won't be able to get that credit without this system, right? So Track It Forward is how Becca's going to go to your teacher and say, yes, I can see they did 25 hours this month or this year, and they've completed the requirement for your course, right? Well, if we don't have the hours to Track It Forward, we can't really prove that that happened. So what'll happen after this is you'll get your placement, you'll get your background check. Once you're all set up, Becca will create an account for you in this program. And you will, I'm saying that so that she knows, because this is all new to her too. She's gonna then create you an account, and you'll get an email inviting you to join. You can access this program from your smartphone. It's available both in the Android app and the iPhone Apple store. And so you can do this from your phone while you're volunteering. You can also go to a computer and log in. It's just going to ask you to create a password. You use your email address as your username. And all you have to do is select how many hours, when you volunteered, and put what activity you were doing. So if I was a healthcare volunteer, I would just put 2 hours on August 10th and healthcare volunteer and hit submit. That's all there is to it. We ask that you do this for every time that you volunteer. If you're teaching, and we'll talk about more of this when you do the teacher training, you'll also get to claim the hours that you're preparing for class because it's time you spend volunteering, even if you're not directly with clients. So if you're in healthcare, for example, and your job is to help with TennCare applications, which is Medicare in Tennessee, you have to get trained to do that. Those training hours and the service delivery time and any prep that you take all count as volunteer time. Now, this is sort of a outdated list, but we'll go through it. We do need English teachers. Obviously, there's no like morning class versus evening class because we're all online. The classes are happening at all different kinds of times. They're happening in Zoom. And the way we're using teachers, or the way we're using volunteers, is we'll have a lead teacher for the class, and then we have volunteers as co-hosts. And we do breakout rooms. So in each of the breakout rooms, you might have a group of 3 to 4 students that you're working with. You're facilitating their learning process and then going back to the whole group for additional activities, figuring out what the homework is, all sorts of things like that. We also have like a conversation club that's happening Wednesday nights where we're just using breakout rooms to have conversations with people. And they're not difficult. We try to make them as realistic as possible because people need to know how to have a real conversation when they're learning the language, right? And those can be a lot of fun. We cut up a lot, Conversation Club. We also have a chance for people to come in from the community and do workshops. We call those community days. They teach about local resources like the library or the American Red Cross, for example. The school system comes in and talks about, well, they're going to hopefully teach us what the heck's going on with school this year. But they usually come in and say how to break down a report card, right? Because our families don't know how to do that. They don't know how to read a report card. So there's opportunities to join in those sessions too. We normally have childcare, so that in red is actually not available right now. But if we get to go back to in-person services anytime soon, which wouldn't be until October, you might have the chance to be a childcare volunteer. I will tell you, one of my favorite parts about the job that I have is that I wear all the hats as the person in charge of our education programs. And so I've gotten to run the program and train the teachers. I've gotten to teach the classes, but I've also gotten to do the childcare, and that's kind of fun. I've literally had a baby on each arm, rocking them, and had to like use my foot to corral a 3-year-old into the bathroom. Because we have sometimes 15, 20 children between the age of 0 to 3 in those childcare programs, and it's a lot of fun. It's not easy, but if you have the heart for it, it can be really rewarding. We also do have programs for both high school students and middle school students throughout the school year, where we're doing things like social emotional learning. So we're talking about self-image and self-identity, relationship building, coping mechanisms. And as part of that, we do art therapy lessons. Now, usually they happen inside the school. We're trying them on Zoom. It's kind of working. So there's still a lot of things that need fixing with that model. But what we're really doing right now is we're doing a case management model where individual staff members are getting assigned to 15 families, 15 children, and they might be elementary, middle school, or high school aged, and we're doing everything we can for them. We're getting them a computer, we're getting them signed up on internet, we're helping them understand what school is going to be like, we're putting them into learning management systems like Khan Academy or a reading program called Light Sail. And then we're basically identifying all the needs that family has, whether it's food security or employment support, anything we can do. And so we're taking volunteers digitally, virtually into those families' homes with us as we're kind of delivering those services. And I think that's going to be a really rewarding process. We have had a little bit of resistance from our eligibility department in getting volunteers right now because they don't have any new arrivals. There's no refugees coming into the country right now. So it's really hard to have work to be done. But that's going to be a big part of Becca's first job here, is figuring out creatively how we can continue to use you all to help us make connections with families. And so there's going to be opportunity out of that if you're interested in things like helping a family get on government supports like SNAP, or helping them get cash to, cash assistance to be able to make rent that month. There's definitely some opportunity. We just have to figure out where we can plug volunteers in. If you're interested in that program, please let us know, because we'll try to include you in whatever we can develop. We also have employment assistance. A lot of the employment work that's being done is in the office. So if you feel comfortable going into the office, we do have masks and gloves available. We're also doing it on a rotating basis so that no more than one person is in each section of the office at a time. You can actually help sort paperwork, fill out paperwork related to people's job searches, and help them do things like practice interviews, take them to a job interview, for example, help them figure out how to dress for an interview. That's always a fun one, because every employer is different. If you're going to Tyson, it's not business tie and dress shoes. If you wear dress shoes, they won't let you in. You need sneakers because their interview is on the floor of the factory. So it's really kind of unique how to do each job interview. One of the things that's not on here is the family mentorship program. And that's when we get a group of volunteers together to meet all of the needs of an individual family. So you might do things like help them go through their mail for the first time, because guess what refugees don't understand? Junk mail. So they will try to pay every bill that comes their way, sensical or otherwise. You might help them you figure out their field trip forms that the school sends home. Whatever they're kind of struggling through when you're there is what you get to help them with. Now, we're not doing that program in person right now, but we want to have a version of it that's online. To do that, we need to connect those families with technology. So there's still some work to be done in getting that off the ground. And we have no new arrivals. So we don't have the same audience that program's targeted for, but we have the need to be in homes. So we're still going to try to do some mentorship this year. And we really like people that are brave and willing to try something new, because it's probably going to be a challenge to get off the ground. Everything is a challenge to do when you can't really meet with a family in person. I'm not going to go through this wholeheartedly because right now the rules are kind of out the window. I'll be honest with you guys. Not all of our volunteer opportunities can take up 2-hour space. Some of them we might need more, some of them we might need less. Our needs are changing a little bit. What I can talk about is we will be committed to however we can get your experience to work. So if there's something you really want to do for families in this model, maybe the story of the journey of the refugee has sparked an idea with you, or you already had a connection that you wanted to make with these families, let us know and we will try to get it working. Because I would rather be accommodating to the weirdest volunteer group ever than not have any volunteers. Right? And that's the thing. In adult education right now, because we're only meeting in the classroom 2 hours a week total, you could volunteer for an hour as a co-host once a week, or you could volunteer for 15 if you really wanted to run a class. But it takes 15 hours a week to run a class by yourself right now. We're trying to find a way to scale that up to include more volunteers. But I think right now, realistically, that idea of being in a breakout room and helping digest material someone else is being paid to teach is probably going to be the only way to get this done. Unless any of you have 15 to 30 hours of time on your hands and you're really, really desperate to spend it with us, which I will take you totally. But I know that's unreasonable. We do ask that when you're a volunteer, you try to make it through at least one 9-week session or a semester of school. So this should actually say about 2.5 weeks. That's because the majority, again, of our volunteers are in the education department. So our classes happen in quarters, right? And so we kind of feel like it's decent practice for you to stick around for at least a quarter in anything that we do, especially for some of our nittier grittier programs like healthcare. You really have to be in it for a little while to understand it. And if you're here for less than that, it makes it really hard for us because we're constantly retraining people. And it makes it hard for the volunteer position to really be helpful. It's really important to be punctual. I talked about this earlier. Our clients depend on us for emotional support. And if we're not present and we really can't be around or we're not reliable, they notice it. And it can be really traumatizing even further to feel like you're going to get support and then not get it the right way. It also, if you're a volunteer in a big system like an education program, there may not be a way to cover your class and it might get canceled, right? So, it's not as likely in this online virtual space for that scenario to happen, but it's really important that if you commit to being a volunteer that you show up when you say you're going to. There is a dress code, basically to give you the nitty gritty of it. Don't dress like you're going to the beach. It's basically literally in our employee handbook. I don't know why that's the language, kind of funny, but we do ask that you dress business casual. It's okay if you want to wear jeans and a t-shirt and sit at home on your computer. It's not okay if you want to wear no t-shirt and shorts and be on your computer, right? So use your best judgment. Remember that many of our clients do come from more conservative backgrounds socially, and so we want to be respectful of their comfort level. Stay engaged. Anytime you're volunteering with a family or you're in the building or you're at a special event, it's really important that you be present. That's because you're a vital part of the community that's rebuilding these families' lives. And if you're on your phone with your bestie, taking selfies with the kids and not really engaging with them, you're missing out. You're the one that's missing out, really. Because what's in front of you is really important. It's really also important that we maintain the confidentiality and privacy of our clients. We also find it very important to maintain your confidentiality and privacy. So we have regulations in place where, Becca's going to download your volunteer application and it gets sealed in a file and put in her desk and locked, right? So we find that confidentiality, both of education records, health records, personal identifying information, is incredibly important. One of the biggest reasons is because we are a federally funded agency. And so if we break confidentiality, there are pretty big implications for that. We could lose funding or even suffer penalties from the federal government because of that. Photography is really tricky. We have interns and volunteers whose job it is to come to special events and take pictures, right? However, not all of our clients are comfortable with their picture being taken. So we do ask that you look to a staff member for guidance with this. If you are in an ESL classroom and you are just loving the group that you're with and you want a picture with them, it's okay. It's okay to take a picture, but you need to give the clients a chance to opt out and just say, I'd really love a picture with all of you. If you're not comfortable with it, either stop sharing your screen or step off to the side if you're in person with them. This is really important. The more you ask questions like that, the more the families are going to trust that you have their best interests at heart. If there's anything that you see that's out of the ordinary that concerns you during your experience here, please, please, please let us know. Our staff are trained in being trauma informed. They're trained in being the best service providers that they possibly can be. And I know that they will have the right answer for you 9 times out of 10. This is the same code of conduct that our students sign. It's the same code of conduct that our staff sign. I'm going to go through it really quickly because some of the things on here I'm sure feel absurd, but we have to say them for a reason, right? So at some point, somebody's done a majority of these. Bringing weapons of any kind is prohibited to any event, location, or assignment assigned to you by NICE. You are not allowed to volunteer under the influence of drugs or alcohol. That includes our annual fundraiser dinner. We don't get to serve alcohol at that. It happens at a church. The use of cigarettes or distribution of cigarettes by a minor is prohibited. Engaging in abusive, violent, or threatening language or behavior towards anyone that you're in contact with while volunteering is strictly prohibited. And that includes other volunteers. I don't believe that any of that would really get targeted toward clients. It might get targeted at us or among volunteers. And so if you ever feel like you're getting heated because you're having a disagreement with somebody, come and talk to your supervisor about it. Again, we're trained to be trauma informed. We deal with conflict all the time. Our middle school students are some of the hottest, heated people you will ever see, and they get in fights over the silliest things. And I've literally had to hold a Congolese child over my head once. Well, not really over my head, but had to use my CPI training a couple of times to break up fights this last year. We're adults. Hopefully that doesn't have to happen. But again, there's a lot of us on staff that are trained mediators. So if you're really having trouble with somebody, let us know. You know, we are not going to feel bad about it because we understand that underlying factors affect our relationships all the time, and that's just part of being human. Again, damage, destruction, misuse of property, sexual harassment, theft, all off the table. This is an important one. In the state of Tennessee, every person is a mandated reporter, which just means that if you suspect any abuse of any kind, this says child abuse. If you suspect any abuse of any kind, could even be inter-partner violence, that is a very common thing in international communities. So we have a lot of cases of IVP that get filed. We actually have a partnership with the police department's victim advocacy group. There is a non-Hispanic victims advocate for immigrants specifically. She used to work for NICE. If you ever have someone come to you and say that they're uncomfortable with their relationship with their spouse, or if you suspect any kinds of signs of child abuse, common signs might include not wanting to eat, social distancing in normal time could be one, right? Not wanting to be touched or be around other kids. Over sexualized language. If the kids know more than they should or talk about sex more often than they probably should, there might be signs of abuse. If you have any suspicions like that, you are welcome to contact the child abuse hotline yourself and file a case. There's even a way to do it with an online report, which makes it a little less emotionally challenging, right? Because let's be honest, making that call can be hard sometimes. If you don't want the burden of doing that, by telling your supervisor you have been a mandatory reporter. So by communicating with your supervisor, we will do that form for you, and we can even sit with you guys and show you that it's been done. Because it's really, really important that those kind of things get filed. I have had a couple of instances of this in the last year. Let's just say discipline in certain families is very different, especially from Central Africa or Southeast Asia. There's a lot of difference in the way discipline happens. And we've had to sit down with some families, file cases, and get real with them about what's legal and allowable in the United States and what's in their best interest. And most of the time, families will be very amenable to changing how they discipline their kids with our recommendations because they want to stay here. It's really important to them. This does happen sometimes. It won't happen often. Talk to your supervisor about it, because we have to go through it all the time and usually have the right kinds of avenues to support these situations. I'm going to leave this up for just a second. I'm not going to go through all of it. This slide just defines that you have rights as a volunteer. So you're entitled to things like a safe workplace. You're entitled to clear training and understanding what you're doing here. You are also completely allowed to refuse a task you are not comfortable with, right? So if we ask you to do something that you don't feel comfortable doing, you can say no. Now, the only difference there is if you already agreed to something, we do ask that you do it. If you get uncomfortable and you decide you can't, let your supervisor know. Most of the time, we'll be able to find creative solutions around that. You are free to be, you are free from exploitation, right? So we are not entitled to exploit you just because you're a volunteer. And you're also entitled for your personal information and identifying information to be protected and kept confidential. We do ask again that you be reliable and on time, that you come willing to serve this community, that you ask for help when you need it. That's one of the hardest things for any adult or really any human to do. But I mean it. Ask for help when you need it. Be respectful of other people and their confidentiality, and participate in trainings when necessary. If you do choose to be an education volunteer and you stick around for longer than 2.5 months, we have quarterly trainings that help you learn how to be a better teacher, because we can't do it all in that first hour session that we have. I'm going kind of fast because I don't want to run out of too much time here or push us over the 2-hour mark. But if you are interested in getting involved and none of these opportunities really strike home with you, or you just want to get even more involved, there's other ways to do that. Advocacy for refugees in our community is a big one. Turk has been really awake and really active so much the last couple of years, really in the time that when I first came to Nashville, the first person I met was Leah Hashinger, and she's one of the directors now. And there's just a lot of opportunities to advocate for this community. There's a lot of opportunity that you all have that you can provide us with. So you might work in an industry where you feel like no one knows about this issue. You may work in a place where you want to get more volunteers involved. You can invite a nice staff member to come and speak. You might be a member of a community group. I'm on a volleyball team, and I'm constantly making them show up to volunteer orientation. And I'm sure there are mixed feelings about that, but they do, and they have fun. You might want to lead a bake sale or donation drive. We always need winter coats. We always need food for families. And we do mostly need furniture. Right now, we're not taking furniture donations because we don't have any new arrivals. And we can't really facilitate donation during the pandemic. It would be really difficult to do furniture donation right now. You can also help by liking us on Facebook. We also just started a few months ago a YouTube channel. Both are called Nice Nashville. That is also the name of our Twitter handle and our Instagram. Our YouTube channel just made it over 100 subscribers, so we're super excited about that. It's where we're posting all of our classes for people to watch, so you can kind of stay in touch with, keep a vibe on what's going on there. There are also things that you can do just by shopping, like at organizations like Kroger or Amazon Smile, where part of your proceeds from your online shopping can be donated to a charity of your choice, and we would love to be that charity. Okay, so what happens next? Becca's going to take the chat from this session. She's going to put all of your information into our little volunteer tracker saying that you attended, and then we're going to send you guys an email. And in that email, it's going to give you an idea of where we think you would be a good fit. So we'll take in your application, we'll take your first, second, and third choices into account, see how your schedule fits with those programs, and give you an idea of where you can fit in. So that's like your placement decision, basically. At the same time we send that out, we'll introduce you to the staff in that department and send you a background check link. The background check only takes a couple of days, so as soon as that link clears, Becca will reach back out to that person who's in charge of volunteers for that department, and they'll schedule you for your first volunteer activity. Please, please, please let us know as soon as possible if you have like known vacation or time off coming up, or you're going to be unavailable, so that we can go ahead and plan ahead of time to have your volunteer shift covered. So I went through that last part pretty quickly. Take a deep breath. What questions do you guys still have? You can either raise your hand, put them in chat, or just jump off a mute and chime right in.
I have a random question, just more out of curiosity. Why is there such a high percentage of refugees from Bhutan? Like all the other countries kind of made sense, but that one I think was a little surprising.
Yeah, so there are some cultural groups in Bhutan who have been persecuted by the Bhutanese government, and they end up fleeing to Nepal. And so there are actually refugee camps for Bhutanese people in Nepal. So you'll see a lot of our staff members are Nepali, and some of them are Nepali because they're Bhutanese. I'm not as familiar with the push factors in that scenario, but I do know that they have a really close connection with Nepal.
Gotcha. I was just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. If you're really interested, our employment caseworker Buin is from Bhutan, and he loves to talk about his country.
Oh, I would love. I'm obsessed with that country. It's
I'm
like
sure that he would be
one place
willing.
I want to go.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sure he'd be willing to talk to you about it. He's a really neat guy, and he and his wife and kids have just a really sweet family. If you go on our Facebook group, you just reminded me of another fun thing. We actually do profiles of families that are our clients, and Buin is actually featured. So you can actually go in our Facebook page and see a little clip about he and his family. So
Thanks.
yeah, of course. Any other questions?
I just want to go ahead and answer this question that Jasmine just asked, just because I feel like it's relevant to everyone, and some people may not be able to see the chat. And so if you have had a shift in which departments or volunteer opportunities you'd like to be involved in since the time that you completed your volunteer application to now, feel free to be in contact with me to let me know if things have changed, or when I email you, you can reply to that and say, I think I'd actually like to be with this place, or this is my top choice. So I'll just go ahead and put my email in the chat, and then if things have changed, just let me know.
Thanks for fielding that, Becca. I'm sure a lot of people had that question. The other thing you can do is, if on your application or even in the room right now, you feel like you just don't know where you might fit in, when we reach out to you, or you can even reach out to us beforehand, let us know that you're feeling a little uncertain. And one of Becca's responsibilities as volunteer coordinator is to get to know you a little bit and figure out what skills you might have and help you in figuring out where the best place might be to volunteer. So if you're not sure how you would fit in, that's okay. We don't expect you guys to get plugged right into the system tomorrow. It might take a couple of weeks or even a month for you to really get your feet on the ground as a volunteer. And we hope that that kind of really intimate volunteer onboarding opportunity that will help you stick around for a little while and make you feel like you find the right niche in the agency. And, you know, I'm thinking about this too, Becca. One of the things that we do when people first start volunteering is we walk them through the office and introduce them to, you know, Dr. Gatt and some of the staff, and we won't get to do that. So we'll have to find a way virtually to get you guys some introduction time, or at least a chance to meet some of the more interesting among us, more interesting than me at least. I do have a really kind of cute clip of Dr. Gatt basically saying thank you to all the students for sticking in there throughout the online session, and it's pretty cool. So we might be able to put something like that together, welcoming you guys as our first round of post-pandemic or current pandemic volunteers. Great. Well, that is all that I have for you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to stick in the chat. Feel free to stick around. Becca and I will stay on for the next few minutes just to see if anybody else needs anything. Otherwise, you are more than welcome to go ahead and leave. Just make sure that before you do, that your name and email address were put in the chat so you get credit for being here. Thanks, everybody. Really, really nice to see new faces. Can't wait to get you guys in and get you connected.
Thank you.
Saba, can you hear me? She might have just left.
Okay.
I wasn't sure. I saw Saba's name. So I think that is Saba. I think that is Shanam Toski. So Shanam they were a client of ours. And if that's who it is, Shanam used to work for NICE.
Oh, cool.
And she had just gone through HiSET herself. They have a neat family. They're from Iran, but they resettled to well, I probably shouldn't say any more than that since this is not just you and me, but she'll be great as a volunteer.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Okay, well, Cher, did you have any questions for us? Okay, Becca, I'm going to hop off and stop the meeting. So great job tonight. Thanks for helping facilitate everything. I hope that was a good look at what the volunteer orientation really does.
Definitely.
I will say that one of my top concerns has been for the whole 2 years that I've worked at NICE is that it's just so heavy. And I'd love, you know, in person we get to be a little more interactive. I make people get up and like act things out, like going across a border, you know, and just what it feels like. I think the heaviness is important. I think people appreciate the heaviness, but I do wish that we had a way to pull back out of it and highlight, and maybe I didn't do a good job of this just tonight, which is to say how our programs are really targeted at those needs and overcoming that trauma and making people feel invested again. But I think people got a sense of that. I will say I would love there to be something that just took that kind of heaviness and cleared the air and kind of reset the atmosphere. That's always been something that I've wanted from that training. I'll also show you the data that's in there is from UNHCR's At a Glance report, but there's also this one that you could use to update that material pretty regularly. This is, can you see my screen? I can't really tell what I'm.
No, I can't.
I don't see the green.
Oh, now I'm on your desktop. So
okay, hold on.
Okay.
Yeah, for some reason my computer's not showing me the green border like it normally does. So that's the presentation.
Yes.
Can you see global trends? There it goes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is an overview of forced migration in 2019, the trends, so you could borrow some of these infographics and some of the data, and then there's even like particular stories. So this one's about Nigeria, Burkina Faso. Yeah.
Okay.
I usually say a little bit about Felipe Grando. I can't talk tonight. Filippo Grandi. I just flipped the ending of his first and last name, who is currently High Commissioner. There's also like a lot for those nerds who get into the data behind it and want to hear more of the story. UNHCR does an annual report. It is lengthy, but I really think it's a critical read. So if people ever ask how to find out more, that's a good starting place. Yeah, they do one of these reports every year. And this is not their big annual like they basically look at State of the Union for refugees around the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yes, I'm gonna have to do some research because I am definitely not as knowledgeable about like all of the different I guess like push factors.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because you wouldn't expect people to ask those kinds of questions, but they really do want to know. And I guess I like to use a lot of examples that are from specific territories. That's just because I've done a lot of study. A lot of my graduate coursework was on migration and immigration. And so like for me, it's easy to think, okay, because I know this situation, let's specifically think about Congolese living in Tanzania, right? And I know that for example, the ratio of student to teacher in Tanzania camps is 1 to 125. Right. So, and the ratio here is like 1 to 25, right? So you have 5 times the number of students for every teacher, and school stops when it rains. You don't have to know those things to be an effective onboarder of our volunteers. Now, it is kind of neat, and it's, if the research is something you want to do to grow your content knowledge about our client base, I'm all behind that.
Yeah.
Don't feel like you have to do this exactly the same way I did. I've seen some volunteer coordinators that talk about the dress code and get all funny with it, and I don't know. There's ways to make this your own, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And as long as we get culturally sensitive, emotionally engaged volunteers who show up, this part can look how you want it to. Those are the non-negotiable things. We need humans and we need them to care, right?
Yeah.
I did not remember to ask everyone if it was okay if we recorded the session. We did record it though. So in your email back to them, we might just say, please forgive us, we forgot to ask permission. This session was recorded. Please let us know if you don't want the recording to be shared with future groups of volunteers, because we could use the training to share out with people. And then the other thing, you have that video link for the Rima story if you want to include that in your follow-up with people. Okay. It's in the presentation embedded, and so you can actually click it and go to you have to shift.
This is the Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson.
It's a really great story. I wish.
Civil War began.
Yeah, I think I've actually seen it before.
Can you hear it?
Their entire lives behind them.
Yeah, it's not very good, but I can hear it.
Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. I'd love to find a way to share that with people in the orientation now that we're virtual, but I don't know if we'll be able to or not.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll have to do some thinking about that.
Yeah.
About what we can do. But
yeah, that's kind of a hard one. Here's the interesting thing. We were talking about the majority of people being women and children.
Yeah.
Let's see. Tennessee Office of Refugees puts together data, and it's usually broken out, but I don't think it has. See, when Catholic Charities presents the data to us, they make it a lot flashier than what they put up on their website, I guess.
Interesting. You think it'd be opposite?
Yeah. Well, and they may just not have all of the data they normally have.
Mm.
This is too detailed for this audience.
Yeah.
One of the fun things, too, that we can share is, like, in our employment department, what our earnings average. So we average something like $15 an hour at the middle, with our highest earning clients making $23 an hour.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it is. That could be a win, a celebration that changes the tone a little bit, you know. Man, I wish that I... So, how familiar are you with the governance of resettlement in the U.S.?
I would say I'm not an expert, but I'm not a total novice.
So, you know, the Department of Defense does the last interview, but it's the State Department that's actually responsible for resettlement. And the branch of the State Department that does that is the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, or PRM. So you'll hear Cindy a lot of the time say, oh, I've got this meeting with PRM. Or PRM and OOR are doing a meeting with us. ORR, sorry, is the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and it is a office within the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, but it's all part of the State Department. So basically, PRM hosts ORR, which funds TOR, Tennessee Office of Refugees, and then TOR funds us. They don't fund all of us. They don't fund our resettlement, because that's done through PRM by ECDC, our VOLAG, right? So PRM gives ECDC the case, they give it to us. But what TOR funds is our Refugee School Improvement Program, our health program, our employment program, and our eligibility department. And basically all of that works on a formula where that funding is directly tied to the number of arrivals we've had that year. So they don't fund our arrival system, but they fund us based on our arrivals, you know, so it's kind of weird. Yeah, but you'll hear more about all of that as you're around. You know, part of it's just keeping your ears open, because we all talk about all this stuff so much. And I've learned a lot about populations I wasn't as aware of in just having this job. One of the reasons I don't know the push factors in Bhutan is I've never studied it, you know, so I guess I've never really thought to ask Buin. I will warn you, anything you ask Habibo, or actually she just legally changed her name to Mulkey. She's the first client that we resettled and works as a caseworker right now. And if you ask her a question, she's going to answer it, whether or not you're ready for the answer. Okay. And yeah, so she is one who, her father was actually murdered by the tribe he was a member of. And so she has some tension there. But she will very willfully tell you the story and talk about it in detail. And you know, she'll talk about her mom. We have really great staff who are just very open. And I think a lot of, like, I didn't fully understand how the Rwandan genocide contributed to the destabilization of Congo, right? Until we had a receptionist, Yasant, who was Rwandan, and we just talked about it all the time. And she was, in Rwanda in the 90s and lived through it. And so, that's another, you don't necessarily have to research it to find out the stories. You might find the stories out from people who've lived them that you'll get to work with. We have a really unique set of people. A lot of our staff were not refugees, but they come from countries refugees come from as well. So like Fozia, who you've met in our education meetings, she's from Somalia, but she wasn't a refugee of Somalia. She worked in Pakistan as a translator for the UNHCR, but she wasn't ever resettled to Pakistan. So she's worked intimately with refugees her whole life. And, her friends from Somalia were refugees for the most part. So it's a neat little work environment that you stumbled into here. All right, I know it's late. I could talk about this stuff all night. I won't. Do you have any questions from me just about the orientation?
Yes, I did. So one question.
Oh, you're going out a little bit, Becca.
Oh, can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay, I think I was covering my microphone.
Oh, okay.
One question that came into the chat that I didn't bring up to the whole group was someone asked if they can only volunteer in one department. And I said that they weren't limited, but that we would need to have a conversation about what they can realistically commit to time-wise.
Yeah, that's a great question. You could volunteer in all the departments in some way, shape, or form. The other thing that we didn't really pitch, because we're not going to have any anytime soon, is special events. We usually talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
We have volunteers who only exist in the apartment complexes, meeting clients on the ground, doing special events. So like for World Refugee Day, we've had Nashville Soccer Club come and do soccer camps and had everybody bring food and have, icy machines and popcorn and, games all day. And we can't really do those things right now. We usually have a back to school kickoff. I feel kind of crummy that we can't do it. We didn't get to do our student celebration at the end of last year. So we use volunteers for all of those things too, and they're a little more interdepartmental. You'll also get a lot of in, I would say, November. I'm so sorry. You're going to get a lot of requests to have groups come in on their spring break and volunteer. We can accommodate them to a degree. The problem is usually their spring break aligns with ours and all our classes are closed. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so we've tried to do some spring break things with the youth, but we don't know what's going to happen between now and March. So
totally. I'll have to think about it. Cool. Well, thank you so much. This was really great. And I'm glad that you were here to answer some of those questions, because I was like, I don't actually know. So,
well, I will say one of the things that I like about doing this is I can usually field most of the questions, but it is completely okay to say, I don't know the answer, but I will find out for you, as long as you follow up with people. We can't have the answers to all the questions, but we should definitely have the ones about our own work, so that's kind of why I had you meeting with all the people who really execute the work on the ground, because that's something that we'll really have to have intimate details about for these volunteers. They might just have the simple question of what can you do in the education department, or what can you do in employment, and giving a really detailed answer is going to help people imagine how they fit in.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Those conversations have been good as far as learning. Definitely everyone's feedback has been I don't want any volunteers right now.
I know.
So I'm going to have to get real creative and also persuade people.
I know it. And I get why people feel that way. I
Yeah.
also feel like we need to bring that up to leadership and just say, hey, people are feeling really stuck. And I think volunteers could be a way to be helpful, but unless we make them try it, they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically what we had to do with the teachers. I had to make them want to do distance learning, and now they kind of love it because it eliminated some of the barriers we didn't know we had,
Mm.
you know.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of opportunity in having volunteers take on some of the workload that we're
Yeah.
under because of this pandemic, but
Yeah.
people are intimidated by that. They feel like it's going to be more work than it's worth. So if we can find a way to make it easy on them and helpful, I think that's going to be huge. I
Yeah.
don't know the answer to that yet, but
No, I'm doing a lot of brainstorming. I'm excited to talk with you and Allie tomorrow.
yeah.
Like,
Well, and we don't have to exist in a vacuum. No one ever does. You know, we could reach out to other agencies. We could reach out to CNM. I think that training's going to be great. Cindy did approve you for that, by the way. I think you saw
awesome.
that email. I think getting in touch. So Stephanie Still is a person at Hands on Nashville who used to also teach ESL classes at NICE. But that her job is at Hands on Nashville. And so we might, consult with them a little bit and say like, hey, we're really struggling to imagine how to use volunteers to the normal capacity that NICE does.
Mm-hmm.
What are you guys seeing other agencies do? Or even going through Hands on Nashville. Hands on Nashville is just a volunteer match service.
Mm-hmm.
So they've got all their, postings that we could go through and just read what other people are putting up and see, if we get ideas that way, or talk to people who are in similar positions to yours at other agencies. I had a great conversation with one of the EL directors at Turk, and they're trying to like put up hotspots all throughout the city where MMPS can't. And like, hey, if we want to get volunteers who are tech savvy and want to plug in some hotspots, I'm sure Turk would love that help. If people want to deliver food or laptops to families who are shut in,
Yeah.
let's take them.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think some people just feel stuck with the work they have, and so they feel like there's a lack of ability to be creative. And I think that's something we're going to have to bring up to leadership.
Okay.
And just see what we can do to unstick some people and how to help them be more creative. So like Nadia, for example, in eligibility, I'm sure that related to her responsibilities as eligibility coordinator, it is hard for her to think about how a volunteer can help enroll people that don't exist, right? But Nadia was also the community liaison of the youth department, and her job was building relationships with people all across the city. So, we should be pushing her to think outside of her work role to her skill sets, and maybe think about how she might help us build volunteers to help with this idea of mentorship. So, we met with the school system, and we kind of decided that we would like to try to take a leadership role among the service providers who focus on refugees. So there's a youth refugee roundtable where all the service providers that serve refugees with after-school programs come together, and we'd really like to suggest that group create some kind of comprehensive mentorship program for our English language students, because without that, they're going to fall through the cracks of virtual schooling. Well, Nadia might be a great person to know the right people in those groups to really motivate them to participate. Even though that's not her job in eligibility, she's not enrolling anybody, she might have the creative energy to support us. We just, I think, maybe have to get people to think outside of the box they're in. And I think part of that's also how we phrase the question. How could we be using volunteers right now? What can you do to help us? Maybe a better question than what can we do for your department? We'll just have to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm trying to like bridge the gap, or I guess walk the line of like, I don't want to like stress out staff that are already stretched too thin. Because I feel like that's what's being communicated to me, is that they're like, it's just more work than I have the capacity for right now. So I've been trying to help them brainstorm ways that like I can take on more of the onboarding.
Right, exactly. And I think that is going to be the solution. I mean, I don't want to overload you in the long term, but I think that having you help train the volunteers and help develop a training plan for the volunteers in every department is going to really help what feels like a burden to the staff on the ground, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody should ever feel like an extra pair of hands is a burden. But I get why they do. Could a volunteer go through your emails? You know, could they identify just the basic stuff, help you go through your email account and respond to the BS emails, right? Let me turn the recording off. No, I'm kidding. Because we all get them. We all get emails that maybe are easy to respond to